When I first moved into the quiet cul-de-sac at the edge of town, I believed I had found the perfect place to settle down. The house wasn't just a building, it was the culmination of years of saving, planning, and dreaming. With its brick facade, well-kept lawn, and spacious backyard, it felt like a sanctuary. The kind of home you imagine raising a family in, or spending long evenings on the porch, watching the world slow down. For the first few weeks, life was calm, the neighborhood was peaceful, children rode their bikes up and down the street, and retirees tended to their gardens. Most of the neighbors greeted me warmly, offering waves or brief conversations, but not everyone was pleased by my arrival. Across the street lived a woman whose reputation I had only vaguely heard about from passing comments. Her name was Karen. From the moment I met her, I sensed a subtle hostility. While others smiled, she scrutinized. While others offered casual welcomes, she offered warnings about how things worked around here. She spoke as though she held authority, as if her word was law. At first, I brushed it off. Every neighborhood had someone like that, a person who thrived on control, who treated the street like their personal kingdom. I assumed keeping my head down and minding my own business would be enough. But I soon realized that Karen wasn't content with being ignored. She thrived on confrontation, and she had set her sights on me. The first incident seemed small. I returned home one evening to find a note taped to my front door. It was written in neat but sharp handwriting, claiming that my car was parked improperly and that I was violating community rules. At first, I laughed. My car had been in my own driveway, well within property lines. There was no possible violation. I tossed the note in the trash and went about my evening, thinking it was little more than an annoyance. But the notes continued. One accused me of letting my grass grow too long, despite it being freshly mowed the day before. Another claimed that my trash cans were placed at an unsightly angle, aligned exactly as the waste management company instructed. Each note carried the same tone: authoritative, demanding, and dripping with passive-aggressive superiority. Then came the day I spotted Karen herself standing in front of my house, clipboard in hand, scribbling notes while surveying my yard. When she caught me watching, she didn't look embarrassed. Instead, she gave a pointed stare, as though daring me to object. I tried to dismiss it, but unease began to creep in. It wasn't just the notes or the staring, it was the feeling of being targeted, as if every detail of my life was under surveillance. I had purchased my home to find peace, not to live under a microscope. The situation escalated when I received an official-looking envelope in the mail. It bore no return address, but the letter inside was startling. It claimed to be a formal warning that my continued disregard for neighborhood standards would result in further action. The letter referenced housing compliance and vaguely mentioned the possibility of forced removal. At first, I thought it had to be some kind of scam. There was no homeowners association listed when I bought the property, and the language in the letter was suspiciously vague. But the tone was intimidating, written as though eviction was not only possible but imminent. My stomach sank as I read and reread the letter, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Who had sent it? The answer seemed obvious: Karen. The style matched the notes she left. The tone carried the same smug authority, but the escalation from petty harassment to something resembling an eviction threat was shocking. I decided to check with the city office to confirm. The clerk pulled up the records, assuring me there were no associations, restrictions, or complaints tied to my property. The letter was fake, legally meaningless. Yet the fact that someone had gone to such lengths to forge a document to make it appear official sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't about rules. This was about power, about control. From that moment on, I realized Karen wasn't just an overbearing neighbor. She was a predator in her own right, one who would stop at nothing to impose her will. And while I had brushed off the earlier notes, this was different. This was personal. Still, I told myself I could handle it quietly. I'd keep my property spotless, my car neatly parked, my trash bins aligned. I'd give her no ammunition, but I underestimated her determination. Because within weeks, I would find myself facing something I never thought possible. Karen wasn't just trying to make my life miserable. She was about to launch a campaign to take away the very house I had worked so hard to call my own. And that was only the beginning. The weeks following the forged eviction letter were tense. I had convinced myself that keeping my head down and avoiding conflict would minimize the problem. But Karen was not the type to be satisfied with silence. To her, indifference was defiance, and defiance was fuel. It began with subtle changes in her behavior. I would catch her standing at the edge of her driveway, arms folded, staring at my house for a long stretch. Sometimes, she would be on the phone, pacing, her voice rising as she gestured in my direction. Other times, she scribbled furiously on her clipboard, muttering to herself. It wasn't the normal quirkiness of a nosy neighbor. It felt like surveillance, like she was collecting evidence for some larger plan. One morning, I found another envelope taped to my door. This one, even more official looking than the last. It carried a bold header that read housing violation notice. The letter accused me of repeated infractions and stated that the Homeowners Enforcement Board was reviewing my case. The threats were sharper this time. Warning of legal action, fines, and the possibility of eviction if I failed to comply. It would have been intimidating if not for the glaring truth. There was no Homeowners Enforcement Board. I had already checked with the city, and there was no HOA governing my street. The letter was nothing more than a fabrication. But Karen had clearly invested time and effort into making it look real. She wasn't just a busybody with a clipboard anymore. She was manufacturing authority where none existed. I began documenting everything. Every note, every envelope, every suspicious incident. I knew that if this escalated, I'd need proof that I wasn't imagining things. My phone's photo gallery, filled with pictures of taped letters, screenshots of my lawn freshly mowed on the days she accused me of neglect, and even short videos of her pacing at the edge of my driveway. But Karen wasn't done. Her harassment moved from paper threats to physical interference. One evening, I returned from work to find that my trash cans had been dragged into the middle of the street. Another morning, I discovered a small for sale sign planted in my yard, as if to suggest my house was already on the market. It was unsettling, not just because of the acts themselves, but because they hinted at her larger obsession. She wanted me gone. What unsettled me more was how she involved others. A neighbor down the street casually mentioned that Karen had been going door to door, claiming that I was a problem homeowner. According to her, I was supposedly bringing down property values, ignoring community rules, and preparing to abandon my house. The smear campaign was in full swing, designed to isolate me and make me look like the villain. The first crack in her facade came during a chance conversation with another neighbor, an older gentleman who had lived in the cul-de-sac for decades. He leaned in and said, almost conspiratorially, that Karen had pulled similar stunts before. She had targeted a young couple who moved in years earlier, spreading rumors and fabricating complaints until they sold their home and left. He warned me that she thrived on intimidation and that her ultimate goal was control, sometimes even to the point of driving people out. It was a chilling revelation. This wasn't just about me. It was a pattern, a cycle, and I had stumbled directly into it. I tried reporting her harassment to the local authorities, but without concrete proof of direct threats or damage, there was little they could do. They advised me to keep records and avoid confrontation. That advice, though well-meaning, felt hollow. How could I avoid confrontation when she had made me her target? Karen, emboldened by what she saw as inaction, ramped up her efforts. She began leaving typed notices not only on my door, but also in the mailboxes of my neighbors, claiming that I was violating shared property agreements and that she, as the head of the housing board, was taking steps to resolve the issue. She had given herself a title, invented a board, and declared herself the authority over our street. And the scariest part, some neighbors started to believe her. People began giving me suspicious looks. A few stopped waving. One family quietly stopped letting their kids play near my yard. It was subtle, but the shift was undeniable. Karen's lies were seeping into the neighborhood's perception of me. She was rewriting reality, one fake notice at a time. For the first time, I felt genuine fear that her delusions might actually succeed. If she had driven others out before, what was to stop her from building enough pressure to make me leave? But there was one thing Karen hadn't accounted for. I wasn't planning to give up so easily. Unlike her previous victims, I had something she hadn't encountered before: an unshakable determination and a growing arsenal of documentation. What Karen didn't know was that her empire of lies was about to collapse under the weight of her own obsession. Because as much as she tried to paint herself as the authority, the law and eventually the truth was on my side. And soon, I would make sure everyone knew it. By the time fall arrived, Karen had escalated from petty harassment to something far more dangerous. The fake letters, the self-appointed titles, and the whispered rumors had laid the groundwork for her boldest move yet. It began with another envelope, but this one wasn't taped to my door. It was delivered through the official mail service, stamped and sealed, and it bore the insignia of the county clerk's office. My stomach dropped as I tore it open. Inside was a notice regarding a property ownership dispute that had been filed against me. According to the document, someone had submitted paperwork claiming that I was unlawfully occupying the property and that the rightful ownership belonged to another party. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. A clerical error? Maybe. But as I scanned the paperwork, I recognized the handwriting on one of the attached forms. It was Karen's. The audacity stunned me. She had gone beyond fake letters and neighborhood gossip. She had actually filed fraudulent documents with the county, attempting to start a legal process to remove me from my own home. The notice required me to respond within 30 days to avoid further escalation. While part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity, another part of me understood the seriousness of the situation. If ignored, even fraudulent claims could snowball into a bureaucratic nightmare. I wasted no time. I gathered every piece of documentation I had been collecting. The notes, the fake eviction letters, the photos, and the videos. I contacted a lawyer who, after reviewing everything, confirmed what I already suspected: Karen's filing was not only baseless but also criminal. She had crossed into forgery and fraud, crimes that carried real consequences. Yet even with that reassurance, I couldn't shake the unease. Karen wasn't operating rationally. She was consumed by her need for control, and people like that didn't stop just because they were caught. They doubled down. Sure enough, within days of my lawyer filing a response, Karen intensified her campaign. She began telling neighbors that I was fighting an eviction, twisting the truth into a narrative where she was the righteous enforcer of order and I was the rule breaker resisting justice. She stood on her driveway, voice loud enough for half the street to hear, painting herself as a hero, protecting the community from a dangerous outsider. The chilling part was that some people seemed to believe her. Neighbors who had once been friendly now crossed the street to avoid me. A few even muttered under their breath when I passed. Para din Karen sa line sa bas standards and community rules. It was as if she had built a cult of personality, all centered on her warped view of authority. The strain weighed on me heavily. Coming home no longer felt like returning to a sanctuary. Instead, it felt like stepping into enemy territory, where every glance from across the street carried suspicion and judgment. The place I had worked so hard to claim as my own had become a battlefield. But Karen had made a critical mistake. By filing fraudulent paperwork with the county, she had left a trail that couldn't be erased with gossip or intimidation. The law would not look kindly on forged signatures and falsified claims. My lawyer assured me that once the case went before a judge, the matter would be thrown out quickly, and Karen could face penalties for her actions. It was a small comfort, but I clung to it. At least there was a clear path forward. Still, the waiting period was agonizing. Every day until the court date felt like walking on thin ice. Wondering what Karen might try next, I installed security cameras around my property, worried that she might escalate further, perhaps tampering with my home or attempting some other form of sabotage. Then, just when I thought she couldn't surprise me again, she did. One evening, I came home to find a large sign planted in her yard facing my house. Painted in bold letters, it read "Illegal occupant across the street. Community will prevail." It was a declaration of war, visible to every car that drove through the neighborhood. She wasn't just harassing me privately anymore, she was attempting to publicly shame me, to turn the entire community against me in a spectacle of humiliation. And as outrageous as it was, I knew it was part of her plan. If se couldn't legally force me out, she would socially isolate me until living there became unbearable. But what she hadn't realized was that by going so far, she had also pushed the situation past the point of being a private neighborhood squabble. This was now a legal matter, one that would play out in a courtroom where her lies wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. Karen thought she was untouchable, that her fabricated authority made her the queen of the cul-de-sac. But soon, she would learn that real authority didn't come from forged letters or shouted accusations. It came from the truth and from the law. The court date was approaching, and with it, the moment Karen's carefully constructed empire of lies would begin to crumble. The day of the court hearing arrived with the kind of heaviness that seemed to sit in the air. I had barely slept the night before, my mind replaying every possible scenario. Karen had shown herself to be unpredictable, and I wasn't sure how far she would go when forced to defend her lies in front of a judge. I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer at my side, armed with a folder, thick with evidence. Every note, every forged notice, every video clip of her lurking around my property was neatly organized and ready to present. My hands trembled slightly as I carried it, not from fear of losing, but from the tension of knowing this confrontation had been building for months. When Karen arrived, she was almost unrecognizable from the smug neighbor I had seen pacing her driveway. She was dressed in a stiff blazer, clutching a stack of papers, her chin tilted high with false confidence. She looked at me briefly, her eyes flashing with contempt, as if she truly believed she was the rightful victor in this charade. The courtroom was quiet as the judge entered, and the hearing began. Karen wasted no time launching into her story, speaking with a conviction that would have been impressive if it wasn't entirely fabricated. She claimed that my property was improperly acquired, that I had failed to comply with community housing regulations, and that the board she supposedly led had voted to remove me. The judge listened patiently, occasionally furrowing his brow as Karen's words grew more elaborate and fantastical. She spoke of bylaws and ordinances that didn't exist, citing sections and articles that she had clearly invented. She even attempted to present her forged letters as evidence, sliding them across the table with a flourish as though they carried the weight of law. Then, it was my lawyer's turn. Calmly, methodically, he dismantled her claims, piece by piece. He presented the property deed, proving my ownership beyond any doubt. He pointed out that no homeowners association was registered for our neighborhood, making Karen's so-called board a complete fabrication. He displayed the forged eviction notices, highlighting the inconsistencies, the mismatched fonts, and the absence of any legitimate government seals. Finally, he played the video footage clips of Karen pacing in front of my driveway, clipboard in hand, scribbling notes, and muttering to herself. The courtroom watched as her obsession unfolded on screen, leaving no doubt about her intent. Karen's composure began to crack. She interrupted repeatedly, insisting that she knew the rules, that the community demanded action, but each outburst only made her look more unhinged. The judge raised his hand for silence more than once, his patience thinning with every baseless claim she attempted to force through. By the time my lawyer finished, the contrast between us was clear. On one side stood documented truth, legal ownership, and evidence. On the other stood bluster, fabrication, and obsession. The judge leaned back, his expression one of measured disbelief. He addressed Karen directly, questioning her about the board she claimed to represent. Her answers were vague, circular, and defensive. When pressed for names of board members, she faltered, stumbling over imaginary titles and invented positions. It was painful to watch, like a house of cards collapsing under the slightest breeze. Finally, the judge delivered his ruling. The claim was dismissed entirely. My ownership of the property was affirmed beyond question, and Karen was warned in no uncertain terms that her actions bordered on fraud and harassment. The judge even mentioned the possibility of criminal charges if she continued her campaign. I felt an enormous weight lift off my shoulders as the words were spoken. Months of tension, of being painted as an intruder in my own home, evaporated in an instant. Justice had cut through the fog of lies, leaving Karen exposed for what she truly was. But while I felt relief, Karen's reaction was something else entirely. She stormed out of the courtroom, her face twisted with rage, muttering under her breath. It was clear she hadn't learned her lesson. In her mind, she wasn't defeated, she was wronged. As I walked out into the sunlight, Victory in hand, I knew this battle was far from over. Karen had lost in court, but people like her didn't simply stop. They regrouped, they schemed, they looked for new angles, and I could feel it in my gut. Karen wasn't finished with me yet. The next chapter of her campaign was coming, and while I didn't know exactly what form it would take, I knew one thing for certain. She would stop at nothing to make me regret standing my ground. The courtroom victory should have been the end of it. For most people, being publicly exposed, humiliated, and warned by a judge would have been enough to force retreat. But Karen was not most people. To her, the loss wasn't a lesson, it was an insult. And insults demanded revenge. In the days immediately following the hearing, there was an eerie calm. Karen retreated into her house, blinds drawn, her car rarely leaving the driveway. I allowed myself to believe, however briefly, that perhaps the judge's stern warning had sunk in. Maybe she had finally been forced to confront the reality of her lies. But then the retaliation began. The first incident was small but deliberate. My mailbox, once pristine, was suddenly bent at an odd angle one morning. The post cracked as though someone had kicked it with force. There were no witnesses, of course, but I didn't need them. I knew exactly who had done it. The next came a few days later when I discovered that my lawn had been littered with garbage fast food bags, crushed soda cans, and even broken glass. It was scattered carefully, almost artistically, across the yard, not the work of a random passerby, but of someone who wanted me to feel targeted. Then came the noise. Late at night, around midnight, I would hear loud banging, sounds, metal clattering, car doors slamming, even blaring music. Each time I looked outside, I caught glimpses of Karen's silhouette darting back toward her house. She was trying to keep me awake, to wear me down, to make my home feel less like a refuge and more like a prison. I contacted the police, filing reports for each incident. But without direct evidence tying her to the acts, there was little they could do. They increased patrols through the neighborhood. But Karen seemed to operate in the shadows, careful to never be caught in the act. Her campaign of harassment didn't stop at my property either. She ramped up her smear tactics with the neighbors, portraying herself as the victim of a dangerous man who had humiliated her in court. She told anyone who would listen that I was unstable, that I was destroying the neighborhood, and that she was only trying to protect everyone else. Some neighbors saw through her lies, but others, those already swayed by her earlier gossip, clung to her narrative. A divide formed in the community, with people choosing sides. Barbecues and casual chats that once brought the street together grew tense, with whispers and judgmental glances cast in my direction. The tension reached a breaking point when I discovered a fresh notice taped to my door one morning. Unlike her earlier forgeries, T's one wasn't pretending to be official. Instead, it was personal. Scrawled in thick marker, it read, "You don't belong here. Get out before it's too late." The threat was clear, and for the first time, I felt the chill of genuine fear. This wasn't about forged authority anymore. Karen had abandoned the pretense of legality and was now embracing intimidation. I doubled down on my precautions. The security cameras around my property multiplied, motion-activated lights illuminated every corner of my yard, and I began storing backups of every recording in case she tried to tamper with them. My lawyer advised me to stay vigilant, to keep building my case. And then, as if to prove how far she was willing to go, Karen escalated once again. One evening, I returned home to find spray-painted words across my garage door. Illegal. The paint dripped down the panels in ugly red streaks, a scarlet letter for the entire neighborhood to see. It was vandalism, blatant and undeniable. This time, the police took the matter more seriously. The cameras had captured her, who'd pulled low but face visible enough for identification, crossing the street in the dead of night with a can of spray paint in her hand. The evidence was undeniable now. Karen had finally given me the proof I needed. The police promised to pursue charges, and my lawyer prepared to add the vandalism to our growing list of complaints. Karen had wanted to push me out, to intimidate me into leaving, but all she had done was trap herself further. And yet, even as justice seemed closer than ever, I couldn't shake the unease, because Karen wasn't finished. She had been cornered, yes, but cornered people were dangerous. She had already crossed so many lines, and I feared the next step she took might go even further. The war for my home had reached its darkest chapter yet, but the endgame was approaching. Soon, Karen would face the consequences of everything she had done. The footage of Karen spray painting my garage door was the turning point. For months she had hidden behind lies, forged documents, and whispered slander. But this time, she couldn't escape. The video showed everything. Her creeping across the street, the glint of the spray can in her hand, and the angry red letters she scrawled across my property. The police moved quickly. She was charged with vandalism, harassment, and trespassing. For the first time, it wasn't just my lawyer standing against her in civil disputes, it was the weight of the criminal justice system pressing down on her. When word spread through the neighborhood that Karen had been arrested, the shift was immediate. The same people who once entertained her gossip now neighbors who had stayed neutral finally admitted what they had long suspected, that Karen's obsession had gone too far. Some even came to me quietly to apologize for believing her stories. But Karen wasn't ready to accept defeat quietly. Out on bail and awaiting trial, she stormed through the neighborhood like a ghost of rage, shouting at anyone who dared to look her way. She cursed the HOA for failing to protect her. ACCUSE. Neighbors of betrayal, and doubled down on her claim that I was the villain. Her final attempt at control came during the HOA's monthly meeting. Karen marched in, disheveled but determined, demanding that the board vote to have me removed from the neighborhood for everyone's safety. Her voice shook with desperation as she repeated her lies. But this time, there were no nods of agreement, no murmurs of support. Instead, the board president calmly reminded her of the evidence, the charges, and the fact that her actions had endangered the peace of the entire community. Then, in front of everyone, the board voted unanimously to strip Karen of her HOA. She would no longer have any say in neighborhood affairs. The room, once her stage, had turned into her undoing. By the time her trial date arrived, Karen was a shell of her former self. The once proud enforcer of imaginary rules now stood trembling before a judge, forced to listen as the evidence was laid out piece by piece. The forged notices, the harassment reports, the security footage, the vandalism, it all painted a damning picture. The verdict was clear. Karen was found guilty and sentenced to probation, community service, and a restraining order that barred her from coming within a certain distance of my home. The judge's words were final and sharp. If she ever crossed the line again, she would face jail time. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I could breathe knowing the nightmare was finally over. My home was mine again, free from the shadow of her harassment. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood slowly healed. The ugly red paint on my garage was replaced, the whispers faded, and the sense of community began to return. My dog once again roamed the yard without fear, and I no longer jumped at every noise outside. As for Karen, she became a recluse. The woman who had once thrived on control now hid behind closed curtains, her voice absent from the neighborhood she had tried to dominate. Some neighbors pitied her fall, while others saw it as justice long overdue. Looking back, I realized Karen's obsession had never really been about me. It had been about control, about her need to feel powerful in a world that no longer revolved around her. When I refused to bend, she broke. The war for my home had tested me in ways I never imagined, but in the end, the truth prevailed. My house remained mine, my peace was restored, and Karen's reign of fear was finally finished. For the first time in a long time, I stepped onto my porch, felt the sun on my face, and smiled. My home was safe, and no one, not even Karen, would ever take that away from me again.